کنفرانس بین المللی ایران چشمانداز تغییر 29 ژوئن 2018. پنل سوم، سپاه پاسداران و تاثیر تحریمها.
We're going to talk about the IRGC and sanctions. I am going to start with Bruno Tertre. He is the Deputy Director of the Fondation pour la Recherche Stratégique. And then I'm joined by Mr. Eduard Lindner, the former Deputy Minister of Interior of Germany. Be very interested in his comments. Michael Pregent, the Middle East Analyst of the Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C., and Ambassador Robert Joseph, U.S. Special Envoy for Nuclear Nonproliferation and former Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security until 2007. Bob, it's great to be with you again. So, if you have been following the conversation today, you've heard from senior military officers and from intellectual and editorial observers of Iran and the regime. I want to challenge this panel to ask the basic question, what can sanctions do? How important is the IRGC in terms of the violations of international law and international norms and the aggression that is being visited upon the Middle East? And so, are sanctions the best and most appropriate response? Do they work? And to get us started, let me turn to my right and your left, and let's hear from Bruno Tertre.
Replies about the politics of sanctions. Let me make 3 or 4 points about this. First of all, it's undeniable that sanctions matter, and they've been particularly important to force the regime to accept a negotiation which led to what some call a bad deal, what I would call an imperfect deal, but that's the deal we have. Some would say we had, but it still exists, at least on paper. When you look at how much the regime lost in oil revenue during the high period of sanctions, maybe $150 billion more. When you look at the contraction of the economy, maybe 15–20%, it's undeniable that sanctions did play an important role in forcing this regime to the negotiating table. When you talk about sanctions against Iran, obviously targeting the IRGC matters a lot because it's ultimately today the core of the regime. However, I would say that in any policy regarding the Islamic Republic, sanctions are a necessary but insufficient component. Sanctions are not a magic bullet. We've noticed, we know, you know, that this regime has been rather resilient, that many Iranian entities have found ways to live with them, to live with sanctions, that the IRGC has adapted, unfortunately, to sanctions. Sanctions are not the only tool that exists to influence the Iranian economy. Variations in oil prices, I would argue, have been as important. The problem is that sometimes sanctions backtrack. We all know that. Those who've been in government know that the fine-tuning of sanctions is an art, not a science. So sanctions have to be fine-tuned. My hope, and I think it should be everybody's hope, is that the current disagreement, major disagreement between the US administration and most European governments on the fate of the JCPOA will not prevent us from finding agreements on some particular issues related to Iran policy. This is why it's extremely important to lower the political temperature between both sides of the Atlantic now that the Trump administration has made its choices that most European governments, including myself, regret. But that's the situation we're in. But what we don't want is this regime to benefit from a transatlantic crisis over Iran policy and its direct and indirect consequences. How will Europe approach this new phase? I think it's hard to Hard to deny that European businesses will be extraordinarily wary of doing business with Tehran. They know that their economic interests lay more with the United States than with the Islamic Republic. But this does not mean that Europe, and the EU in particular, will not be willing and able to take targeted sanctions for specific IRGC behavior regarding the missile program, regarding terrorism, or regarding trafficking, for instance. In the end, I think sanctions, it's commonplace to say they're not a magic bullet. I would just say they're necessary but insufficient. Sanctions will not bring down this regime. The IRGC, of course, will not go down without a fight, and it's important, as you said, Linton, to try to have them evolve against their will, if necessary. But ultimately, change in the Republic of Iran will come probably more from the exasperation of the Iranian people themselves due to the mismanagement of the economy, due to the massive corruption, due to the brutality of the IRGC, than only through sanctions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for your kind invitation, but of course, owing to its key function in the Iranian system of rule, the Revolutionary Guard poses a problem which Europe cannot avoid to engage. It is by no means a marginal issue. Trade is essential for a country's well-being, but one has to probe a partner offering himself when considering opening or maintaining trade relations with him. Good trade relations are characterized by safety and stability, but precisely these are conditions that the Iranian regime is unable to guarantee, since it is threatened in its existence by the relentless protests that have been going on for months. Any principal change in Iran is conditioned by dismantling of the Revolutionary Guards. The Iranian Revolutionary Guards commands has an enormous amount of power, and the economic and political and security sections at its disposal, and is therefore the most formidable obstacle on the way to democratic change. In this light, it is obvious that sanctions against the Guards and persons connected with it can be a substantial contribution to approaching democracy in Iran. This should be combined with an effective support of the democratic oppositions. We are going to do that in Germany. Time and again, it is maintained that the sanctions imposed on Iran affect primarily the country's population and should therefore be lifted. If we look at things more closely, we will find that this statement does not apply to Iran. As a result of the 2015 nuclear deal, sanctions imposed on Iran were largely raised. Suddenly, $140 billion are disposable, and additionally, the oil production was increased from 1.5 million barrels to 2 million barrels a day. The population benefits from none of those means. Riotous corruption and enormous spending by the regime on terror and war abroad did not leave any money to be spent for the people. We have to realize these facts. New sanctions will primarily affect the regime. Crimes cost money. A regime that has less money at its disposal than before cannot commit so many crimes as in the past. Okay, in the view of the key positions the Revolutionary Guards hold in keeping up the representative rule and in fostering terrorism in other countries of the region, it must be regarded as an important success for the Iranian resistance that the US listed the Iranian Revolutionary Guard as a terror organization in October 13, 2017. The Canadian Parliament has recommended its government not to establish diplomatic relations with Iran as long It is ruled by Khamenei and his terrorist revolutionary guards. This step was clearly a response by the Canadian lawmakers to an unbiased information on conditions in Iran, which the Iranian resistance has been delivering for years. And German security authorities continuously warn against the Revolutionary Guards and its terrorist squads force activities. It is essential for European countries to consider that the US and Canadian initiatives as potential examples of the attitudes they should adopt towards the Guards. And I hope we can in Germany do something for that this decision or this opinion comes up within the government and in the public opinion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Okay.